All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started, and we know we expect a few other folks to be wandering in. Thank you.
Almost us wandering in.
We were rushing. We were running in. So I'm so excited and so honored to have the speakers that we have here today. I want to note, I don't think they're here yet, but wanted to note that we do expect some elected officials. We think Senator Darnell and Senator Wynn are both on their way. Hey, Lindsay. So we'll be excited that they can join us. I also want to recognize Dr. Eric Truppen. Just really glad that you made it. Eric Truppen, of course, is the founding director of Evidence-Based Practice Institute and advisor, and has played a big role in evidence-based practice. Really glad that you're here. I'm going to just say a few words before I hand it over to Dr. Kim Dumont. And tell you a little bit about the William T. Grant Foundation. Not sure how many of you know about it. Yeah, take a seat, Kim. I'll be. But I wanted to set this up for some of you who aren't as familiar with their work. So I think right now, my opinion is the work that the William T. Grant Foundation is doing to support and frame the conversation around how to think about research, policy, and practice is really game-changing. From its inception, the William T. Grant Foundation has funded research to support the elimination of inequities in child and adolescent development. Some notable research projects include work done by Dr. Spock in the 1950s, Jane Goodall in the 1960s, and in the 1980s supported quite a bit of research on youth who are being left out of, who were failed by public systems. So after decades of funding basic and applied research studies, in 2009, the Foundation launched a funding initiative to better understand how research is acquired and used in policy and practice. And then since 2015, they've funded work intended to demonstrate what strategies actually work to improve the use of research evidence in ways that benefit youth. So we're honored today to have the Senior Project Officer of that work, Dr. Kim Dumont, here to discuss the importance of the area and some of the lessons learned to date. So Dr. Dumont manages the Improving Use of Research Evidence area. Prior to joining the Foundation, she worked as a research scientist with the New York State Office of Children and Family Services and directed research on home visitation for children at risk for abuse and neglect. She knows firsthand what it takes to bridge research with the needs of policymakers and practitioners. And for my money, she's one of the most knowledgeable individuals in our country right now about strategies for actually building these bridges. We're also incredibly honored to have Dr. Vickie Ybarra also speaking. Of course, many of you know her already. Speaking personally as a resident of this state, I could not be more excited that she is leading the Office of Innovation and Accountability at the new Department of Children and Children for Youth and Families. Children,
Youth and Families. It's a mouthful, yeah.
The new department. That's why I keep stumbling over the acronym. Where she also literally builds these bridges every day. Dr. Ybarra has led the implementation and evaluation of numerous family support programs. She served in policy leadership positions, and she holds adjunct faculty appointments at UW School of Public Health and University of New Mexico. So just to let you know how this is going to go, Dr. Dumont is going to speak for about 45 minutes, and then followed by remarks from Dr. Ybarra. And then we'll spend the balance of the time. We should have about 30 minutes or so left to sort of ask questions and discuss. And Kim is also very much welcomes your questions as she goes. So please help me welcome Dr. Kim.
I'm not sure I can live up to Sarah's introduction, but thank you for it. I'm Kim. That's how I think of myself. It is true that I've been at the Foundation for 8 years, actually, just a month ago. And before that, I worked for New York State Office of Children and Family Services. And the reason that I say that was in that role, I worked in their evaluation and research division, and within the strategic planning and policy development unit. And so in that role as a researcher, I bridged both with the programmatic divisions as well as with the state legislator, commissioner, budget offices learned a lot about the policy-making process and where research did and didn't fit in that, and some of the considerations that go into that. And I think as I moved into the foundation, I brought some of those ideas with me in that role. And prior to being in the New York State Office of Children and Family Services, I worked at a New Jersey medical school on the research faculty in a more traditional kind of research on the longitudinal study of child abuse and neglect. So I say these things in part to tell you that my background is very much in the area of child abuse and neglect and human services. And I've occupied 3 different roles since graduating with my doctorate as a researcher within a state organization, and then within the foundation as a program officer. And if I go back a little further, which I think is also relevant, I went into this line of work because I had spent about 8 years as a person delivering services as a recreational therapist. A lot of energy, and so I worked in those settings, in different kind of mental health settings, and learned firsthand about some of the frustrations and some of the joys of doing that work. And so that's who's standing in front of you today. I always like to just introduce myself a little bit. And as Sarah said, I really welcome questions throughout. I'm not really comfortable for talking for 45 minutes, although my kids may think so. But so just ask questions as we go along. So the talk had a different title on the flyer. Some of it I took out on the first page. And it said something along the lines of, what does the evidence say about strategies to produce and use research evidence in impactful ways? And I took out the strategies because it wouldn't fit on the slide, but I do want to talk about those today. And I took out the, what does it say about producing use of research evidence, because I consider Washington State exemplar in the way, the structure you've already put in place for thinking about developing informed research agenda. But we spend a lot less time in our conversations talking about what it takes to get the research that's produced, even when it's relevant and responsive to our questions, to actually get used in practice and to get used in ways that actually realize the outcomes or the systems change or improvements that we hope to see. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. So I have 3 different ideas that I'm going to weave in and out. It's not divided into sections. I want to tell you a little bit about research use and use, and why the William T. Grant Foundation cares. Share a little bit about what we're learning from some of the research that we're supporting, and then talk about the implications of this work. As Sarah said, we were founded in 1936 by William T. Grant, hence the name, and he owned a 5 and dime store. And he started the foundation with an explicit focus on research and how it could be used to better understand human behavior and make changes so people could live, his words, happier and healthier lives. His first question that he put on the table was one that was self-serving. How can I select employees who will be loyal, hardworking, stay with me? And the other that came along is that how can I support them in their lives with their families as they mature to lead more productive and happy lives? So the foundation has kept this focus on research use and how it can be used to improve people's lives since its outset. We give out about $12 million, $12.5 million a year. And so this requires that we make some tough choices about ways to narrow our funding so that it has a chance of being impactful. So one way to describe this over time is it's focused on pressing challenges confronting young people in our time. And as I said, we support high quality research, and this is always focused on US-based youth ages somewhere 5 to 25. 8 years ago when I started, it was 8 to 25, so we've expanded a little bit. So that's how the foundation steps into this space. And as I said, we organize our research around focus areas. Right now we have two. One is on reducing inequality. The argument being that we know a lot about the causes and consequences and contours of inequality on the basis of race, ethnicity, language, immigrant origin status, and income, but we know much less about how to respond to reduce inequality. So we welcome studies in that area. And the other focus area is on improving the use of research evidence. And again, at this point, when we made the shift in 2015, we acknowledge that we know a lot about the barriers to research use and how research is used in both policy and in practice settings, but we know much less about how to create the conditions that support that. So we have that focus. So our goal with these broad aims of improving research use in policy and practice and reducing inequality, which are pretty lofty, we recognize that there's a long distance between the research that we invest in and use outcomes. So we've added, internally we talk about supporting research to inform policy and practice to improve the lives of youth. But there's some distance between our investments and that part, which is really what led us to our interest in the use of research evidence. So too often policymakers and practitioners' ideas fail to shape research agendas. And as I said, I think that based on everything that I've read, and since I was introduced to the WISP when I was back at New York State Office of Children and Family Services, I think that there's a lot of research that's generated in Washington State that really reflect some of the needs and questions of policymakers. But too often researchers lack the incentives to undertake, inform the policy to improve practice. And here you set up a structure to ensure that there are researchers who are pursuing these questions that the legislative body has. But we have to think also in practice settings, what might that look like? And too often the resources are lacking to bridge the gaps between those two needs. Further, there are misalignments between the research community and the policy or the practice community, how they think about research, in what they consider high quality research. So often researchers will put a lot of weight on the rigor and how much reach the research has, what kind of incentives and rewards they get in their own careers to be promoted, and in policy and practice, they want it to be relevant. How does this research apply to the work I do in Kings County? That's the question that comes up. What's the engagement? How do I find out about the research? There's often, can't reach it behind firewalls. It costs money to subscribe to research. And what's the capacity that we have to actually do this in the way it was intended to deliver the service? So this leads us to missing opportunities to capitalize on the potential of research to meet the outcomes that we look for. So all this is a long introduction to say, what is it that we study? So the phase one, understanding the use of research evidence, was really initiated by my boss, Vivian, who's the president of the program. And at the time, the team asked, how do mid-level managers, state and local leaders, and intermediary organizations that sit between policy and research, practice of research, access research evidence, make sense of it, and then use it? And what conditions support this use? And there was a very strategic decision to focus on this mid-level managers, state legislative bodies, people who are making decisions about how resources get allocated, about whether or not to purchase evidence-based programs, about which ones are most appropriate, how do we invest in staff capacity, what are our training needs, what are the positions we need to hire. So it was really on that. Just as a context, at this time, there was a lot of work being supported in dissemination and implementation science, which focused much more on the frontline workers. And so they wanted to move back upstream from that. So I want to just define a couple of terms. So what do we mean at the foundation by research? We define it as applying systematic methods and analyses to address predefined questions or hypotheses. And we consider, we value a lot of kinds of research. Research that communicates people's lived experiences, all the way through cluster randomized trials to understand whether a program that's intended to make a difference is living up to that promise and who it does and doesn't matter for. What do we mean by the use of research? This is fundamental to ours. So we think about, there's lots of different kinds of uses. I'm going to just talk about 3 today. The first is a strategic use of research evidence. We see this play out all the time in the media. And this is when research is used to advance an idea, a position, or cause, or in some less pleasing ways when research is conducted to actually find a particular outcome. But let's put that aside and let's say that we use it for research. We see this, and I went through and I pulled out the Juvenile Justice Delinquency Prevention Act of 2002 and just highlighted some examples of where research was used in this legislation to make the case that we needed to do something to inform this two-pronged approach. And so the research was leveraged to help pass this legislation and to make the case for the approach that was being proposed. Another kind of research use that we see is an instrumental use, where we call on research to help us make a decision about how to work better. And so I would put evidence-based programs as also often being called on to address a particular problem, the opioid crisis or other issues that we have. Relevant to some of the work that's being done in Washington State, the Positive Achievement Change Tool is one example of an instrumental use of research evidence, where you have a risk assessment that's research informed and you're using it to try to better just figure out what the needs are of the youth and how to allocate services accordingly. And there's in a validation study right now, but that my understanding is that other research is done. This is pretty easy to follow a chain. You have a goal to use this research tool, research informed tool, and you can see whether or not it's being used and in what ways. A more subtle kind of research use is the conceptual use of research evidence. And here we think about the research informs or seeps into your thinking about how you understand a problem, how you might frame a response to it. And here, rather than calling on specific packages or tools that have been research informed, we think more about cumulative bodies of knowledge, about how these seep into our thinking. And so an example that I pulled up from the work you're all doing is the opportunity-based probation idea, where you're building on the research that was put out by the National Research Council and the Annie E. Casey, and trying to develop a program that builds on what we know about brain development and these uses. That would be a conceptual use of research evidence. But while we have these many different kinds of uses and we can theoretically see their value, the use of research evidence happens in very busy spaces. That's the way I like to think about it, where regardless of whether you are developing legislation or trying to make a decision about the referral, there are a lot of pulls on your thinking. Some of those are about what your own intuition, professional expertise is, about the data sets that you have access to, about what your peers are doing, about political pressures, about. So it's in this context that we want to understand what happens with research. And so I want to give 2 quick examples of some of the work that was funded in phase 1 around research use. Less to tell you what they learned and more to show you what a study about research use looks like in this context. So the first one I'm going to take is the Common Core, which is in the education space. And they wanted to figure out how to develop common standards in math and English, language arts for K through 12 to make sure everybody had access to it. So this is a standard question. The study looked at who are the potential users of the research evidence, from the governors all the way down to the state boards, these are at the state level, who are going to use the standards. You can see that they didn't go all the way down to the practice level. They are thinking in a policy space. And then they broke the policy process into 3 stages: defining the problem, developing the standards, and then adopting the standards or the implementation plan. And then they looked at the research that was used to inform the development of the standards. So this was about the policy-making process. So that's the study that was done. Another study looked at, well, now you have the Common Core standards, what happened to them? How were they actually implemented in the districts? And so another study that we supported looked at what happened in districts. And here it's less about what's on there, but they adopted a frame of trying to understand what are organizations' capacity to absorb new information and change their ways of working. And how might we track how these ideas that are introduced to the district actually make a difference to district policy and instructional practices. And so they studied different ways. What are the networks that exist within school districts, and how do they shift, or how do they exchange and document the flow of information from the Common Core standards? They observed deliberations in curriculum instructors to figure out where research used or went out the window, how it was grafted to a particular setting. Karen Lindhorst gave me that word. She's at UW and University of Washington, and so forth. So this is an idea of what a study looks like on the use of research evidence. So what did we learn from all the studies that we supported in phase 1? Well, we learned that there's a lot of things going on in this space, and that the research context, the user context, and all these pieces come together, that they influence strategic planning, problem understanding, that there's use of research as well as other kinds of evidence, and at the end of the day, these may affect youth outcomes or not. So I can pull together a picture of all the things that matter. And this wasn't particularly novel for the use of research evidence literature. We knew a lot about some of the challenges to doing this work. What we lacked was more of the texture of what it means for how we work. And I think that was a contribution of some of the grants that we funded that began to make hypotheses about how you might work differently to how to have research use valued. So I like this picture of the network ties. And here there was actually intervention to show how they shifted over time so that these nodes or these pieces were growing, that more people were connected, sharing information, because it shows a very dynamic process. It's not something static that research evidence is going into. And research is more likely to be valued and used when it's designed with the decision-maker needs in mind. So we know that, we have heads nodding. When the relationships with the researchers or the knowledge brokers are characterized by trust, we know that, but how do we engender trust in relationships? What kind of activities or structures do we need to make that happen? We know that research is more likely to be valued and used consistent with ways that it was intended when there's opportunities to debate it, to make sense of it, to apply it to your own context, and to really push back. And these opportunities need to be structured. So I have one example I loved from New York City is that the Commissioner of the Administration for Children and Family Services, when they subscribed to 7 evidence-based programs, rented warehouses in Brooklyn and had workers come in and visit the warehouses and different developers in each of these spaces. And they had the opportunity to just ask questions about the evidence-based program and what it meant for their work. So that would be an example of it, but building it into the routine. And then the last piece is when your policy and daily routine reinforce the use of research evidence. So that was phase 1, and as Sarah said, we launched the second phase in phase 2 in 2015. And here we shifted our questions a little bit, building on what we have learned to try to understand how do we create the conditions. We know what matters to research use. We know it's money is most likely to make it more probable that it's used, but how do we get to that point? So that's what the next set of studies focused on. And the second piece was that much of the first initiative was focused on just understanding research and had disconnected from the youth themselves. And so in our second phase of work, we added this last piece about when and how using research improves youth outcomes, to invite people to study this, to test the assumption that if we use high-quality evidence in smart ways, do we get better outcomes? We don't have a lot of evidence. There are reasons to think that it will pay off. Research, as I said, can help us understand problem spaces, inform or frame the responses. They can support workers, training, help us we have a lot of literature on motivation. We have a lot of literature on implementation science. We can have cost savings from using research with research use, and we can avoid harm, also important in the spaces that we work in the human services. So a second or a third thrust of this was, at the time, and we've now been 10 years, weighted 10 years into evidence-based policy. And this is a big thrust that's coming out. We're seeing more and more, I don't know if you can see this, it's not really, mandates that are incentivizing the use of evidence-based programs to lead to better outcomes. And in WISP here in Washington, there's a lot of energy spent on reviewing that evidence base, understanding the cost savings from engaging with these programs, and helping us, by the way it's laid out in our clearinghouses, try to fit particular programs to the needs of the youth that we serve. So a second set of questions, or a third set of questions, was really about what works and its promise. The theory of change being that if we use these evidence-based programs, these programs for which there's been a lot of research that suggests that they can lead to better outcomes, that we're more likely to see better outcomes. Fairly straightforward theory of change. But the question that was nagging us, and what we were seeing from our grantees' work, was how do those federal and state decisions to invest in the evidence-based program impact local decisions to actually integrate the evidence-based program with the work that's already done. So we're moving along, we're doing the work that we do every day, we have our patterns, we believe that, and we may have some evidence that suggests that they're actually moving us towards better outcomes with youth. We have success stories to tell about the way we work now and youth who have graduated, moved on, gotten employment, not recidivated. So why do we need another evidence-based program, and how do we fit it in to the work that we do now? And we wanted our studies to ask some of those questions. We call that evidence integration. So we came back, and some of what we're learning, we have to question whether the what works model really works. And there are some reasons to think that the theory of change is good, but we haven't fully supported, and we need to adjust our expectations or change the way we operate to live up to the potentials of the outcomes that it has to offer. So we know that from the studies that we have been accumulating, that incentives, mandates, ties to funding to use research evidence might get selecting an evidence-based program, might get take-up of an evidence program, but it doesn't always get high-quality use of that evidence-based program in ways that realize the outcomes. That the clearinghouses certainly create access, we see that, but the dissemination, the way it gets pushed out, is fairly passive, and we know from the evidence base that we need more interactive engagement in spaces to let people make sense, debate, and deliberate what these programs mean for their own setting. What works is also very focused on outcomes, less about processes. Now, I say that mindful of the diagrams that Vickie's going to show you, which shows a very strong structure within Washington State to think about ways to structure a learning environment, to be monitoring, to have feedback, to improve. But I'm just suggesting more broadly that here are some reasons why we might not see the outcomes we had hoped to see. So we argue, based on what we're learning, that we need to do better to support the social side of research. And what does that look like? So one thing to do is, I call this realigning. So how do we use the evidence on evidence use to think about ways we might better realize the potential of evidence-based programs and evidence-based policy making? And so we need particular infrastructure involvement. I brought some little tools from my So first, we want to talk about infrastructure investments and capacity. These are fairly straightforward. How do we train our staff to be able to make sense and challenge and evaluate the appropriateness of the research and the evidence-based program for their research? That's one way to think about capacity. What are investments, investing in capacity to be able to vet a researcher that we're working with to make sure that we ask all the right questions that are appropriate for our site, help us anticipate the cost and the training. How do we align our data infrastructure to be able to monitor the things that matter for the program? What are the most salient variables as we go through monitoring the use of the evidence-based program? So these are some of the infrastructure investments, as well as thinking about guidance on position description. What does it look like? Do you need a liaison between the people who are implementing the work and the people who are offering the evidence-based program? Do we need experts in those areas? And there are position descriptions. We also need to realign and think more of what I think of truly as the social side, evidence, about strategies for engagement and integration. And here there's some very exciting work that's been done. And I brought along this one, which doesn't seem like much, but this is Preventive Services Desk Manual. And again, this is from the work that was done in New York City. And I think it's useful for two reasons. One, it sits on every worker's desk. It's a continual reminder of evidence-based and what's at their fingertips to think about. The manual was created with the workers. It answers the questions that they wanted to know about how to select a program for the families that I'm serving. This followed a process of reworking the logic model from the developers to the local site, because many of them had grown up, the models had grown up outside the child welfare system. And the workers went through, and so they started to co-own the programs that had been invested and prescribed to their program. I think of this as a success story because 3 commissioners later, we still have those evidence-based programs, some pretty remarkable changes in outcomes in place in there. So they're attending to what I call that integration and engagement process. I just very too much. Okay, we have another study that we funded that's called the Coordinated Knowledge System. And the Coordinated Knowledge System is just that. It creates a set of benchmarks, a set of tools, and it capitalizes on the relationship, in this case, between therapists and their supervisors to continually orient towards the research around evidence-based and engaging use in therapy. And the study audiotaped the conversations between the therapist and the supervisor to try to understand when they're engaging with the research evidence. If they always go to the same evidence-based program, or if they have mastery of the knowledge to be able to pick and choose different ones depending on the use and the problems that they're facing. Another study that we have that, again, is also at the University of Washington, that's looking at, I would think, very much at this engagement and integration process, is to form teams. And again, they capitalize on naturally existing school teams in a school district. The other one was the natural relationship between the supervisor and the therapist. They're not adding new teams. And in their work, they're causing these, they work with an outside researcher. And the researcher's job is to call out issues when the practice does not align with what the evidence says. And in that way, they have to talk through how to reconcile that, if it's appropriate to reconcile, perhaps it's not. And they make a conscious decision and deepen their knowledge of the research to try to have to figure out whether practice needs to shift or not. Others have taken approaches of doing plan, do, study, act, where they have small cycles of improvement that they use. They pick goals, they track whether they change, reevaluate, and then continue to work in a very circular way. So when we talk about evidence-based policy making, walking through all the way down to the ground about what's required in the kinds of investment, space, and activities that need to occur, we think will improve the impact that we have. The last promising strategy for promoting useful evidence, but more importantly, I think, for promoting impactful uses of research are research practice partnerships, which again, I consider you to have set up here, invited in this group. These are distinct because they're long-term. They're focused on problems of practice or policy. They benefit both sides, and they persist beyond a single project, in part because the partnerships at the institutional level and played out by the researchers or the decision makers who come in and out. And in this way, because it's established at the institutional level, it's able to withstand some of the turnover that happens. For the researchers, they have a better understanding of the local context. They learn about the needs and questions and resources and challenges of the policy or policy leaders and practitioners, and they get ideas that they would not get for groundbreaking research if they stayed in it. For the policymakers and practitioners, they gain access to existing research. They have a thought partner in helping to make sense of it for their local setting. They contribute to the research agenda for new research generated, and they receive assistance in the use of the research. So this may be running a small pilot study, trying to figure out how you make it from one setting or one site to multiple, figuring out the data elements, giving rapid response about analyses, doing background syntheses, all about trying to figure out how to use that. At the foundation, we've set up a website, which I guess was just reimagined and released today, so outdated picture as of today, that lets you explore partnerships in more detail, what kind of structures different partnerships have used, their memorandums of understanding, their principles for operating, different job postings and roles that they have built within those structures to be able to carry out some of the strategies that I described before, funding opportunities, as well as for funders to get them into that support more partnerships. So in sum, I guess I can talk for a long time, you know, the takeaway for me, the big one, is to change how we work to improve impact. And it's not, it's fairly low-hanging fruit for moving forward on some of these ideas, creating forums and processes to learn about and from research, building trusting relationships through these kinds of activities that we talked about before, researching key policies or practice dilemmas, which you already do, and developing policies, tools, teams to integrate habits in daily practice. I think is where the biggest lift is. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm happy to go back, answer any questions.
You use the term assistance for implementing in one of the slides. Back one, or maybe back a couple. Yeah, that's right. Go receive assistance. How do you differentiate assistance from incentives in that circumstance, or is it the same thing?
So I don't think that they're the same thing. I think of incentives as encouragement to do work or rewards for doing a particular type of work. Think of assistance as a support for doing the work. So an incentive or reward might be recognition in a performance review, would be an incentive. Assistance would be I need help restructuring my data set to do this work, to be able to monitor how it's used. Are there times they overlap? Maybe, but an incentive may assist in the use of research evidence, absolutely. But I think what we've learned through our studies, incentives alone are not enough. Yes.
In a large organization, that has many branches, for example, like the combination between state and local government, there can be a substantial distance between sort of central office operations that may be administrative or research, and then implementation at the local level. So in the balance between those two, if you had to say who has the biggest gap to be filled right now, which side would that be? Would it be at the local implementation side or at the sort of central office side?
I never choose between my children. So, so I would say they have very different needs. So what I was trying to elevate here are the needs at the practice level to live up to the promise of being impactful, using research in impactful ways. And at the same, so the policymaker then recognize the needs of the practice and to structure the legislation and the resource investment in ways that actually allow the policy to do that. Jerry, do you want add anything given your study?
I was just thinking about the churn of things, and so sometimes the notion of the central area is dealing with a group of people that are moving a lot more than the central, but it can also go the opposite way in this particular question, such that, and in some sense, the distribution of capacity across place also seems to be an important element in the sense of partnerships as well. Because in some place, a central actor might have central actor may do very well with fairly populous counties or populous jurisdictions because there's resources there to pick and choose from, but that same kind of demand for the same capacity in a rural area may not be present.
So it may be, Carl, that the investment will be able to do the work and see the work on the ground. I don't know. Other folks have really thought, I thought if we have funded Jerry Herding to do work in the first round of research on ages, and it was rolled out. And one of the lessons, correct me if I'm wrong, was that the use of the regional knowledge hubs, I'm going to call them, to bridge between the state and the on-the-ground work was really critical for them. And when they were invested in ideas that broke real well, then you saw a better use of the research on the ground. But when they moved on to the next thing and left that bridging role, unless it was deeply embedded, that did that.
Yeah, I think some of it would be just a notion of moving on to the next thing.
And other folks have relied on what's called community development that have helped assisted with the implementation of research. And these were networks that were created among agencies with some technical assistance. So they built on the cross-agency relationships, which often there's not time or attention to. And they learned that what they learned from each other with this technical assistance work sped up the time to implement evidence-based programs, the quality of it, and the impact. So the structures that sit between to help bridge may be Other questions? Yes.
On one of the slides, something that stood out to me was that it says you want to focus on, and I want to make sure that I'm getting this right, focus on outcomes and less on process.
Okay, so what I said was that in the evidence-based policy, the focus was more on the outcomes, which we understand, and there was less attention in the funding to the process of how we would get to those outcomes.
So it's not saying that that is what works?
No.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to ask, how does that work?
Okay. But I would say that what I described after, I would put in the process, these investments in infrastructure and the social side. And they are both needed. Other questions? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you for inviting me to participate today. What a great opportunity. This is not an audience I get to be with very often, so I appreciate the chance to be with you and to hear of your questions and concerns. And I think our beautiful view today is just a bonus. Wasn't it lovely coming into this space? It's cold out, but there's no rain. And thank you, Sarah, for the kind introduction and invitation. I am the director of the very long office, the very long name. I did not choose the name of this office. It's in the legislation. So the Office of Accountability, for short, we call it the Office of Innovation. Some people try to create an acronym out of it, but it's all vowels, and I don't know how to make an acronym out of all vowels. So Office of Innovation is what we call it for short. I came to this position via the Department of Early Learning. So we are the creation of 3 agencies: Early Learning, Child Welfare, Juvenile Justice, and I was recruited in 2016 to start a new research office in the Department of Early Learning. Secretary Hunter, who was then Director Hunter at the Department of Early Learning, didn't have a research office, and if you met Ross, you know he has to have data and research to know what to do. And so I was recruited to do that in February of 16 and stood up a small research shop at the Department of Early Learning. Unbeknownst to me at the time that I took the position, the governor had just established a new Commission on Children, Youth, and Families to look at the feasibility of starting a new department. That work happened in 2015. The legislature enacted the House Bill 1661, which created our new agency in 2017 to bring together these three agencies. Although the seed for that work started back in 2016, we have only been a complete agency for about 4 months now, since July 1st of this year. So although we've been planning a lot since 2016, 2017 after the legislation started, and we had our first merger in 2018 with Early Learning and Child Welfare, we really have only been a holding department for 4 months. So I say that to try to manage expectations sometimes. We know we've been talking for a long time about the new department, and we have accomplished a lot, but we're still really a baby organization. As you know, I think everyone in this room knows, we were created to bring together these agencies so that we could better align services, identify opportunities for prevention along the continuum of services so we could intervene sooner and create better outcomes for kids. That was the dream. And ultimately, our goal is to produce better outcomes for kids. The legislature created this vision statement for us. Children and youth will grow up safe and healthy, thriving physically, emotionally, and academically, nurtured by family and community. And we have taken this to heart. We have, in the last year, spent a lot of time with stakeholders and staff creating 9 outcome goals that we espouse for children, youth, and families. We will be aiming the organization at substantially improving outcomes for children, youth, and families so that we accomplish this. One of the things I say when I talk to folks about the child outcome goals is we were not created as a new agency to see if we might be able to make things better. This is a huge agency. We're now the 4th largest agency in the state, over 4,000 employees, billions of dollars spent every year. We were put together to substantially improve outcomes for children, youth, and families. The children we serve and those in Washington State that we don't serve are our children, and we have a responsibility to use our resources, including our partnerships, to improve outcomes. That's certainly why I'm here. I mentioned that I have worked for the state since 2016, but I come from the community, and my heart is in the community. I spent most of my career in Yakima County. Anybody from Yakima? Come on. There's usually somebody in the audience from Yakima. On the Zoom, maybe we've got somebody from Yakima. I spent most of my career in Yakima County. My initial training is as a public health nurse, so I did home visits, some of which were child welfare involved families. I spent a career creating programs, building resources in the community to support families, spent 8 years as an elected official on the school board, and just am really committed to making things better for the children, youth, and families that I served in Yakima, as well as those all around the state. So this is really about making things better in a big way. As a researcher and a scholar, and that is a label that's come to me later in life, I think we have tools in research to do that. As Kim has pointed out, and as you all live every day, we have an opportunity, and we live in a state that values research and knowledge. We're very fortunate. Not all states do that. I spent 5 years in New Mexico, a very resource state. It's just every day trying to make things better, but has very few resources to do it. We're very fortunate to live in a state that is relatively wealthy in resources and understands the use of evidence to make things better for kids and families. Our policymakers are very well versed in that. I'm going to share with you just a bit about the Office of Innovation, Alignment, and Accountability so that we're all sort of on the same page and know about it. And then I want to make some specific remarks in response to some of the topics that Kim brought up. Okay, so this is how we think about the Office of Innovation. We were really designed, and we have our own section in the legislation, we were designed and directed to do a few very specific things. First, we were given some specific tasks in the foundation, creating the foundation for the new agency. So our first year was spent, as I said, identifying the new outcome goals for children, youth, and families that would guide the work of the agency. We also worked with Chapin Hall our first year to conduct baseline performance assessment for the agency. How is the agency doing in terms of performance improvement, infrastructure, capacity, staffing, to make things better inside the agency, to function better. We had a work group we sponsored a work group that created recommendations about how do we align the work of this new agency. We were not created as a federated agency like the SAJE, with one big hub and lots of small agencies inside. We are expected to be one agency, one aligned, integrated agency. And so we had some first-year recommendations about broadly how we can go about doing that. So I put all of that sort of in the building the foundation category of our work. And we're still doing some of that work. We also have a bucket of work related to measuring and reporting. So I have about 33 staff altogether, but most of them were inherited from the 3 agencies of origin. I was not given a new bucket of staff. I have about 4 new FTEs, but I was not given a new bucket of resources in order to do all the new work. We inherited the data and reporting team from the old Children's Administration. We inherited the small research team from the former Juvenile Rehabilitation and the small research team from DEL. So those staff have been reorganized, and for the most part, we need to keep doing much of the work that we inherited with those staff. Reporting and measuring is a big piece of that. We have a huge number of staff whose job it is to do the performance improvement reporting for the agency so that the field staff have the information they need to manage their work every day. And yes, that includes some dashboards that help the managers do continuous quality improvement, but for the most part, it's support for the direct field staff who are doing the work. We do have research and analysis unit. We have 4 PhDs doing research. We have PhD supervisor, Sarah Veely, who many of you know. So we do have a fair amount of infrastructure. Again, those are inherited staff who came with research agendas that were prioritized by their agencies of origin. We're trying to reorganize and squeeze some new work out of that and envision other work. The grayed out items here are items that we still haven't done. We're not resourced to do. We know we have to do. We still have not done. So I mentioned dashboards, for example. We have internal dashboards. We have not yet set up external dashboards, which we want to do. One of our calls as a new agency is to be more transparent, to show more data. So we're pushing out some things that we're calling dashboards, but they're really not. They're static reports that are updated once a month or once a year. We really want to push out some performance dashboards so the communities and service providers have better access to data at a lower level of geography. So we are engaged in our research analysis unit in some program eval, ensuring the use of evidence-informed practices. We have some research partnerships going on along the line of what Kim mentioned. Yeah, we still have a lot of work to do. We are interested in doing some work with predictive analytics. We're interested in doing more spatial analysis, subpopulation analysis. So we still have a lot of work to do in that way. And then we are charged in the legislation with supporting and leading reform efforts in the new agency. We know that there are reforms all the time that are available in all of these areas: early learning, child welfare, juvenile justice, and some of them are of interest to policymakers in our state. Some of them are of interest to our leaders in our agency, of interest to our practitioners. And we want to make sure, the legislation wanted to ensure that there was a central place for those efforts to be elevated and supported as they're implemented. We know from implementation science that these things don't get implemented just by passing around an article about how to do them or by a supervisor saying that they need to be implemented, right? There needs to be good support. And these 3 agencies all have examples of implementing reform well. We have a lot of examples of implementing reform poorly and having it not take, but we do have some examples of doing it well. And so we know that the system is capable. We just need to provide enough support. So that's one of the things we're called to do. We are not resourced yet to do that outside of performance-based contracting, which is got a couple of staff. We are not well-resourced to do that work, but we know we need to do it, so we're working on building the capacity right now. So those are sort of the 4 areas of work we do in the Office of Innovation. I don't think there are a lot of surprises there for most of the people in this room, but I'd be happy to answer any questions that folks might have about that. Okay. The legislation specifically calls on us to be a learning organization, and that's part of what we're supposed to support in the Office of Innovation. So I loved hearing Kim's remarks about creating especially the social spaces and the time to have those discussions, to poke at research, to poke at evidence, to challenge it and ask questions. We recognize that we have an explicit consulting role inside the agency, and we're trying to build out what that looks like. We're trying to do things like, if you've ever been to our reports page on our website, all kinds of reports, some of which we've produced internally, some of which we've contracted out or external researchers have done, tons of reports. The ones we produce, that our research team produces, we are now trying to do things like do a little video clip of the researcher talking about the summary of findings, make sure his name and his or her face is available, so if people do have questions, they have a person they can call. We're trying to find new ways to disseminate the information inside the organization and outside so that it's more accessible and usable. But I love the idea of creating more personal spaces where we can actually have conversations about this so that the research is more well utilized. We are actively in our research seeking larger impacts. So always in state government, we know that policymakers seek efficiency, right? What are you doing with the resources we have, and make sure you can show us you're using those resources well before you ask for additional resources, or at least at the same time that you ask for additional resources. So, so we are trying to build an evaluation agenda that helps us look at our existing investments, ask deeper questions. We know that many of the programs we use work, but that the effect sizes are modest. And you know that whenever you look at an effect size from a study, you're looking at the average. But often, if you're able to do deeper analysis, you can identify that for some subpopulations, under some circumstances, those interventions work better, and for some they work worse. We're really interested in getting down into those subpopulations and geographic differences. I can give you a quick example of that. We just recently released our final evaluation for the Family Assessment Response Program in child welfare. We have a Family Assessment Response, which is an alternative response for child welfare. 5-year big Tri-West evaluation. We didn't evaluate it, Tri-West did. Had been releasing the reports all along, every 6 months, I think, throughout the life of the intervention. Tri-West came in August, and we did a big event. They released their final reports up on our website. Nice intervention. It was well implemented. Had a hiccup in, I think, the second year when the legislature pulled the funding, but it was really well implemented for the most part. They found a 17% reduction in placement on average at 12 months. So it's got a really nice but modest effect size. We can see by looking at the implementation data that there is substantial geographic variation to how well it was implemented, and believe that if we were to up the performance in some of our offices around the state, we could probably see a much better outcome than that. So I give you that is an example where we've got a nice program that seems to be producing a nice effect size, but it's still relatively modest, and we think there's more we can get out of it by doing some selective interventions in some of the offices around the state. Kim mentioned research partnerships, and this is sort of how we think about our research partnership ecosystem at OIAA. We certainly partner with other state agencies. We're fortunate in Washington State that many state agencies have research shops, so we partner a lot, especially with RDA and WISIP, but there are other state agencies that we're partnering with as well. Some of those partnerships are required by the legislature, where the legislature tells those entities to evaluate programs or to look at our data, and we're happy to do that. But some of them are voluntary, and we find that the quality of research being done in the state agencies is very, very high generally, so we're happy to have those partnerships. Of course, we have university-based partnerships, and we have partnerships with some of the researchers in this room, and are happy to have those. I had our single data governance person, and we have one in our office, run for me a list of all our WSIRB approved studies that we're running. Not all of them are with external, some of them are our own, but there are over 80. that we are having to track right now, and one person cannot do that. So we are working hard to get more resources in our data governance shop so that we can expand our capacity to do those kinds of partnerships effectively. We, of course, have external analytic partners as well. We work with a couple of contractors that do some ongoing analytic work for us, especially in the early learning space, but in some of the others as well. And then there are other researchers who approach us with ideas that are not associated with any of those previous. So this is sort of the ecosystem that we work in, the researchers we partnership. I mentioned some of the constraints. We have staff constraints on those partnerships, certainly time, as has been mentioned. There are data constraints. We have a ton of data. We have data on everything. Many people outside our agency assume that because we're one agency now and we can all legally access one another's data, that we know things like the crossover numbers. Tell me how many kids from child welfare go into juvenile justice or the other way around. We actually do not have integrated data yet. We have all the data. It's not integrated. Early learning has 7 separate data systems just for early learning systems. Those are not integrated. They are not integrated with child welfare, and nothing is integrated with juvenile justice. So while we can answer a couple questions related to juvenile justice that our practitioners have asked us to do, for instance, when a kid is discharged from a JR institution, we have to know whether he's in state custody and needs to be returned to the child welfare system or not. And so we have a way of one-off looking those kids up, but we don't have an integrated data system yet. We are putting forward a DP this year that you'll see on our website to build an integrated data system, and hopefully that will be funded and allow us to move forward with that. Another constraint that we live with, and I think, Kim, I heard you mention this a bit in terms of policymaker interest. Policymaker interest changes, as we know, right? And often the cycle for the things that a policymaker is interested in are not the same as a research cycle. There may be a great research question and a policymaker really wants to fund the answer to that question. You know, if we're lucky, maybe they'll fund a proviso and give a researcher at the university or at WISUP some money to actually answer that question. But more often than not, it's a question that's asked of a state agency and it's pretty complex, and we try to get the answer to them, and they've moved on to something else. So that policymaker interest in being able to have what's needed to answer that question soon is important, and to recognize when there's a real window of opportunity, when diverting resources in the short run really is the right idea. Nobody's happy with it, but it is the right idea if the opportunity to put a new policy in place it presents itself. These are some current needs and priorities and research questions that we're trying to deal with right now, and as we stand up our new shop, what we're thinking about having to answer. We certainly want to understand better the needs of the populations we serve, what services we need to be putting into place to produce outcomes. I mentioned subpopulation analyses. Performance-based contracting has been a huge resource need for data and analysis resources. I have PhDs and analysts working on our performance-based contracting initiative because it's just a really data-heavy investment in order to, and we've got a nice cohort rhythm going on so that we're not doing all our contracts at once. Put a cohort together, do some analysis on retrospective data, look at the effectiveness of the services, and then use that to build the contracts in the future and incentivize movement on contracts. It's very data and resource intensive, and we've had to pull a lot of our staff to feed it. So you'll be seeing, we also submitted a DP for some additional resources to support that effort. There's a lot of interest, a lot of pent-up demand for questions related to the intersections of services. How many kids, how well are we serving child welfare kids in early learning programs? How well are they doing if they participate? And then, of course, at the other end, how well are we serving kids who are in child welfare so that we might be able to prevent them going into juvenile justice. We know that broadly speaking, something like 78% of kids in state juvenile justice have had child welfare experience. Something like 35% are actually in foster care when they go in. So we know there's a lot of overlap, and we believe there's opportunities to identify prevention points. And then, of course, we're interested in multi-level work. Children, youth, and families receive services and experience their potential adverse experiences in the context of communities and community-based systems. Personally, I'm very interested in multi-level work and looking at how we support communities, support families. You may have heard that we've identified the 23 locales, which is the RDA geographic term, 23 locales around the state at highest risk for child maltreatment. We identified those early on, and then chose 4 at random that we wanted to do some community-based work in, right? Chose them at random because then we've got a nice design. Instead of choosing individual people at random, we chose communities at random. Worked really hard for about 2 years to try to get some funding. Wrote a couple DPs, wrote a couple grants to try to get the funding to do that community-based work. It's not been announced publicly yet, but we just got the federal grant to do that work for 4 years. So we will be doing that in 4 communities: Spokane, Bremerton, Port Angeles, and one of the counties in Northeast Tri. I think it's Stevens. Let me just get those counties mixed up. 4 very high-need communities around the state. Spokane has the persistently highest rate of child maltreatment, has for many, many years, right at the top. So and to, at the same time, evaluate it because those communities were randomized. We've got a nice comparison group with the remainder of the 23 that were chosen. Do you see those 2 steps? Spokane, Bremerton, Port Angeles, and one of the counties in Northeast Tri. So at this point, I'd like to just make sure I comment on a couple of things that Kim mentioned. A lot of talk about evidence-based practices. Of course, we have great interest in this state in evidence-based practices. I think we're probably further along than many states in our use of evidence-based practices. Certainly, we have a portfolio in child welfare and juvenile justice of practices we use and contractors we use in the communities, and for the most part are very pleased with that. We now have a new, because we bring in early learning, we also now have the home visiting evidence-based practices that go along with that, group-based parenting. So our portfolio of evidence-based practices is actually pretty robust. With the new Family First Prevention Services Act, we now have an opportunity in child welfare to deploy and expand more evidence-based practices to prevent kids from entering foster care. We are interested in leveraging that to serve some of our high-risk youth as well. And if you've seen our publicly facing stakeholder work on FFPSA, you'll see a couple of populations that you recognize. Kids who are being discharged from JR institutions, about 450 a year. We're interested in targeting them for additional resources through FFPSA, as well as youth that are in the they now come through the child welfare door through FRS, that are status offending youth generally. We're interested in making more resources available to them as well through FFPSA. We're to figure out how to do that, but we think there are resources to do that. FFPSA provides us an unlimited entitlement for Title IV-E funds with 50-50 federal state match. Unlimited entitlement, limited only by the amount of money that the state has. So we're excited about that. And we think that for the most part, our EBPs in our portfolios have done well and produced good outcomes on average for our families. But we're under no illusion about the limitations of EBPs. It is just as important that our staff are prepared to engage and do the direct work with families, and just as important that our communities are prepared to support families. So although we're excited and we're really pleased to be able to think about expanding EBPs, we are under no illusion that it is a silver bullet. There are many, many other things in this system that need to be improved in order to improve outcomes for kids. Yeah. So I think with that, I will conclude. I'm just going to leave you my contact information, as well as Sarah's. Many of you know Dr. Sarah Vickie, who is our research and analysis administrator. She remains in that position, and we're really pleased to have her between the two of us. We oversee the research agenda for the agency. Stop there and be happy to answer any questions.
Research shows that, between a couple of choices of achieving improvement over time, that one approach, the externally imposed performance regime, tends to suffer from widespread gaming of systems, or pencil whipping results, and so forth. And therefore, the alternative of the long term of supporting internal learning is probably more effective. If the DCYF intends to be an organization that practices internal learning, and at the same time, it's an organization that has lots of partnerships. You mentioned performance-based contracts. How much is internal learning important for those contractors who are going to be assessed through the performance-based contract?
It's a really good question. We certainly recognize that both things need to happen, sort of the externally imposed and the internal. I think of internal, and this is where I thought you were going, I think of internal as our staff and the work that we need to do there, so we have substantial. But your question seems to be specifically about the internal work inside those contractors. We know we have lots of capacity building in the contractors to do. And this has come up certainly in performance-based contracting. I think you've been part of some of those discussions. It's come up as well as we think about planning for FFPSA, because there we're not talking just about converting existing contractors. We are talking about seeking out new contractors who will come to us and expanding slots among existing. And frankly, we don't have enough of an incentive to do that right now, right? Our system is not as robust as we'd like it to be. We do not pay our contractors well enough to incentivize them to open up more slots. So in planning for FFPSA, and this is where most of that discussion is happening in terms of supporting, we have built in things like a rate study to look at rates. We know if we are asking them to do more things, we need to pay them more. We hear a lot about staff turnover among our contractors, and we want them to be able to address that because we know it affects services. We also are building in things like asking for staff, CQI-type staff, who would work like we have CQI staff internal to the organization to work with our staff, who would be available to work with our contractors as they are reviewing their performance metrics and having to be held accountable, that we would have supportive structures in place. We're interested in PBC being a support to providers and not a stick. Right? It is a stick, the contract is a stick. There are going to be eventually, there will likely be consequences if contracted measures aren't met. But we really are trying to build in those resources to create the kinds of learning that you're talking about. Thank you for the question. Yeah.
Dr. Ybarra, could you expand a little bit more into how analyzing and understanding disparities and proportionality is integrated into the research?
Thanks for asking the question, Atlas. So disproportionalities and disparities, I think was on one of my lists. Should have been. Yes. Partnering with researchers working in communities experiencing disparities and disproportionalities. Each of our 3 agencies of origin has done a pretty good job measuring disparities and disproportionalities. You can look at reports on our website from all 3. We are working right now, Sarah is leading an effort inside the agency right now to harmonize those reports so that we start producing 1 report a year for the whole agency on disparities and disproportionalities rather than 3, and different ways to measure them, so you'll be seeing that. But more importantly is moving the dial on disparities and disproportionalities. And if you look at the reports, especially from child welfare and juvenile justice that were produced before we became one agency, the measurements are nice, and the dial hasn't moved very much. And that's not unusual, right? A lot of state agencies struggle with disparities and disproportionality. So we will be seeing increased efforts to address that. We have committed that in our strategic planning process, we're currently in our first strategic planning process. We will have a new agency strategic plan by spring of next year. It will include a plan to eliminate disproportionality and disparities. We are weaving the elimination of disparities and equity overall into our performance-based contracting efforts, so that we are looking at things like disparities in service provision, who is being served, are the families and children who need it most getting served, are we avoiding cherry picking and incentivizing serving the easiest to serve families. We want to serve the families who need it the most. So we're trying to build it into each of these systems. You're a part of that effort in DCYF, so you're well aware of the agency-wide equity initiative that's going on right now to bring us all up to a common understanding of the need for equity. I've done a lot of equity work in my own career. I spent a long time in the Yakima Valley doing recruiting work for getting Latinos into health careers. One of the reasons I went on the school board is because we weren't serving our immigrant kids well. In my view, weren't serving them well. I was on the school board when we became the largest Latino majority serving district in the state. I helped. In 2006, there was some legislation creating the Governor's Council, Interagency Council on Health Disparities. I helped write that legislation, and I was the first chair of that committee. I am committed to doing equity work, and during strategic planning and planning for strategic planning, it was a difficult discussion to say equity is great, but it's not enough. Equity work inside the agency needs to be done in service of eliminating disproportionalities. And we still have some work to do to connect that inside the agency, but that's where we're going. We're certainly open to ideas for how we need to be doing that better. Thanks. Yes, sir.
So Dr. Ybarra, and then if Kim, you want to comment on this as well. So we do some work, a lot of help in trying to think about sort of core components of programs, and you can also think of core messages from research, from a body of research. So I'm versus like a single research study or a single, program. So I'd be really curious to hear your perspective on whether you guys are thinking in terms of core components that sort of span multiple research days that can be taken out of a body of research as you're thinking about this work, or where that might inform decision making, and then if Kim has thoughts about where that's being studied in your portfolio, or when we should be thinking about deriving lessons from a body of research versus a single research study.
It's a great question. I think that in terms of how much we've thought about it inside the agency, I would say that we've probably had that discussion most prominently during the FFPSA discussions, because we're looking at portfolios of evidence-based practices. So we have had some of that discussion. It's especially clear in looking at the body of evidence around engagement and worker engagement, which isn't an EBP, but multiple studies point to the importance of worker engagement to producing outcomes for families. We're thinking here about child welfare. So we're interested certainly in supporting our workers to have more engagement. Ybarra did that a bit. We've got to think about how we would do that. One of the things that's been clear to me, especially in FFPSA discussions, is, and this is again the limitations of packaged EBP, one of the limitations of packaged EBPs, they're good, but look at all we're investing in that. Look at the systems set up for any good EBP. You've got training and support and additional training and data and feedback loops and CQI. You've got really good implementation if they're done well. What if casework was treated and supported like an EBP? What would we do different if we valued worker engagement based on all the research we know, and we invested in it like an EBP? We would certainly do a lot more to support casework than we do now. Even though we invest millions of dollars in casework because we have so many employees, we would invest in it differently. So I can't say that we've had the detailed discussions beyond that, but I certainly would agree that you know, what we know from a body of research, synthesizing a body of research, I think is important, and we need to pay attention to that at least.
Yeah, I'll just second that. I think in part, in thinking about where I was coming to present, I highlighted the use of evidence-based programs or thinking about how to implement them in ways that are probably have a better chance of realizing their outcomes as something that's familiar in the state of Washington. But I 100% agree with you that the conceptual use of research in the problem of tackling disproportionality, one could say, oh, we have a problem, we'll deal with racial bias in workers and staff and how we structure our systems and use an EVP, and probably won't change a whole lot. Or one could use the broader literature and think about social determinants and are people adequately resourced, or as you're saying, you know, how are staff trained, things like that. So I fully agree that there's a limit to what is, but I think that and I also agree with you that if we think about the use of setting up routines and tools for calling on evidence to supplement the expertise that workers already have through the daily work, like case management, that we will move farther as well. So
I'll just note quickly, this is of immediate timely relevance, because Lucy and I are talking about whether we would consider measurement-based care in a standalone intervention for childhood mental health. I think we're going to opt for considering it an important allowable element of an evidence-based approach, not yet a standalone, but that speaks to the over maybe content. There's just a lot there to unpack.
Right. And there's a lot we don't know, right? Even I've seen critique of evidence-based practices. We put millions of dollars as a nation into this, but have we gotten out of it what we expected? Have we gotten out of this what we expected? We need to keep poking at things.
One thing that struck me was your emphasis on process. And yet, when you look at this incipient organization and how it was initially funded, et cetera, it surprises me just as someone overall not engaged in too much of the politics, but not to have an integrated data set as part of a process part, which goes to say something about, but also informs even your agency as how you, when you approach others for research, there must be some level of attention spent to that part of the process.
Yes.
Because obviously on one level you were left without the resources to do something that seems to them. And I'm not, you know, I'm somewhat ignorant of circumstances, but it just, I guess what I'm trying to do is point to the build of research evidence about how best it is to set up the use of research. That particular dimension, if you will, seemed to be absent.
It's not sexy to fund data systems. We have many data systems in state government that are antiquated, needed to have been replaced 20 years ago, are being patched upon patched upon patched, and it's just not, it's very expensive and not sexy to fund.
Well, I'll just much rather have program.
But it is from, say, a research community side, something that has to be taught, emphasized back to.
So I know it's 5 o'clock, but I can't help one more question. I'm super interested in this, and I don't know that there's an answer, but I want to throw it out because I think it's a really, to me, it's a really important question. So I think one thing about the making of evidence, there's certain people who are in positions of privilege to even make evidence. So people who can get the money to either do the research or hire the researcher, you know, who are organized in a way to have access to those resources. And I think that paying attention to that privilege, we also have to pay attention to the folks who are not in the position of privilege to be able to demonstrate the success and the benefit of their organizations in the same way that other people are resourced. But we don't know that those programs are not effective because we don't have the data on them in the same way. And oftentimes, you know, it would just take forever, and WISF knows this for sure, to get the sample size up to be able to compare them to whatever you're comparing them, and it's really hard to do that research anyway, real world settings, et cetera, et cetera. So there's all of these barriers to ensuring that sort of grassroots-driven, community, voice-driven initiatives can be sort of looked at side by side with other ways of producing evidence. We're not going to solve that problem right now and today, but it certainly makes me really curious about, excited to see what you do with the initiative. Guessing that is informing your framework. And I just think that's a challenge we still have to ensure that we can recognize those programs that are benefiting their community and needing to think about ways that we can do that that recognizes the privileges of ways of defining evidence.
And just an addendum is the misuses, historically some of the misuses of the study itself as well as the findings. They're not neutral.
The real challenge, and I appreciate that from your position at the university there that you recognize it. I think we're trying to deal with it in two ways. Certainly, we'd be working on production of knowledge there. FFPSA has given us an interesting window, even though they will only fund practices. It's given us an interesting opportunity to ask communities, what do you want? So, for instance, this has been most robust with our tribal community, where we've had a number of discussions about what is it you'd like to see in your community. We did a survey of tribal communities to ask what prevention practices are already working, that are already in your community working, whether we're funding them or not, whether they're an EVP community or not, but that you'd like us to consider putting on our list. And after multiple discussions and the survey, we came up with 4, 2 of which I think could be evidence-based practices. One's a home visiting practice that Hopkins is the developer on, comes out of the Southwest, and they're on track to have it approved as an EVP family experience. Another is a group-based parenting program, Positive Indian Parenting, that NICWA produces, is the developer on. It has never been evaluated, apparently, but there are funders.
And part of the funder group.
Yeah, part of the funder group. The funders are funding it to try to get it evaluated. And I think it could very well end up on an EVP list after that evaluation. And then they asked for 2 more that are community-based, sort of strength-based, inclusion types of practices. One is canoe journey, which if you listen or live near tribal communities, you know of canoe journey. A number of the tribes in Western Washington use them. And then talking circle or family circle. I was not familiar with that one. I'd heard of all the others. And my promise to them, so we as an agency don't get to decide what's on our list. I mean, we can pick things to put on our list, but the Federal Evidence-Based Clearinghouse is the one that has to actually do the review. We have an opportunity in Washington State that if the feds haven't done the review, we can have a third party do it, talk to WISF, if we're interested in having WISF do that review, so they probably will. I just went into the research literature to look at canoe journey and family circle, and they have been evaluated. People have evaluated these things. So let's put it on the list to ask WISF to review it. It won't be, it's got to be reviewed according to the criteria, but at least it elevates it. Maybe they get approved and we can fund them. Maybe they don't and we can't, but at least it elevates the conversation to say we are interested in having these traditional practices that are accepted by the community. That's the other advantage of community-based practices, that they are accepted by the community and well-subscribed, right? The best evidence-based practice in the world doesn't work if nobody goes. So we're excited to use that as sort of as a test. Can we use FFPSA as a way to try to fund some of these practices And I was really interested as I learned more about those and just read the few evaluations that have been published on them. They are very inclusive practices, right? They're like kids coming out of JR, coming back into the community, being wrapped by the community, which is very different than a therapeutic EVP sit in the room with a therapist. So if we got them approved, would other communities be interested in them besides tribal communities? That might be a really interesting thing. So anyway, it gives me goosebumps to think about it. But that has engendered some really interesting questions that I hope.
Other questions or comments? Thank you all so much for coming out for this discussion. I hope it was useful and helpful. How about a final round of applause? I don't want to